What if the next shock to your paycheck is not coming from Wall Street, but from one narrow strip of water half a world away? What if this war is not really being decided by missiles first, but by the price of a barrel, the fear inside shipping markets, and the silent panic of governments that know inflation can break political order faster than bombs can? Before the next headline tells you this conflict is under control, pay attention to the one signal that does not lie: oil. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and support our work. That support helps us keep building sharp, honest analysis that connects global power to your real life. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. Let's say the quiet part out loud: the real center of this war is not rhetoric. It is not the speech, not the slogan, not even the battlefield map by itself. The real center of this war is oil. More precisely, it is control over the fear surrounding oil. It is the ability to threaten supply, to shake confidence, to move insurance costs, to freeze tanker traffic, and to force every major economy on Earth to recalculate the price of stability. That is why Iran's threat matters at such a high level. When Iran says the oil blockade will continue until attacks end, that is not just defiance. That is a direct challenge to the operating system of the global economy. Tehran is signaling that if it cannot stop US and Israeli strikes symmetrically, it can still widen the war economically. It can still turn geography into leverage. It can still make the rest of the world pay attention through energy shock. And that is where many casual observers get this wrong. They think power only means military superiority. But in strategic reality, power also means the ability to impose costs. Iran does not need to outperform the United States in conventional warfare to remain dangerous. It only needs to raise the price of victory. That is the essence of asymmetric leverage. If you cannot dominate the sky, threaten the artery. If you cannot outmatch the bombers, pressure the system that keeps global commerce moving. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a regional transit lane. It is one of the most sensitive choke points in the modern world economy. When pressure builds there, the market does not wait for a formal blockade to panic. Traders price risk early. Insurers price fear early. Shippers hesitate early. That is how modern economic shock works. It begins with expectation before it becomes full physical disruption. In economics, perception is not separate from reality. Under enough stress, perception becomes reality. That is also why Donald Trump's response was so aggressive. His threat to escalate strikes if Iran blocks oil flows was not aimed only at Tehran. It was aimed at the market. It was aimed at traders, importers, shippers, and American voters. Trump understands something many politicians learn too late: oil is never just a commodity in wartime. It is political authority in liquid form. If energy prices surge long enough, they can punish presidents, destabilize allies, weaken consumer confidence, and turn foreign policy into domestic anger almost overnight. This is the deeper structure of the conflict. Beneath the language of military success sits a harder truth. This war is now about who can absorb pain longer, who can transmit pain faster, and who can keep political order intact while the economic pressure spreads. That is why the barrel matters more than the slogan. The slogan can dominate a news cycle. The barrel can rewrite a national mood. And here is the warning Americans should take seriously. The moment oil becomes a weapon, this war stops being a distant event. It moves into your gas tank, your grocery bill, your airline ticket, your electricity cost, your monthly sense of security. That is when geopolitics becomes personal. So no, the real center of this war is not the speech. It is not the spin. It is not the performance of control. The real center is oil, because oil is where military force, financial fear, and political survival now meet. And once that triangle locks into place, the conflict becomes far more dangerous than leaders are willing to admit. Trump's war message, strength, speed, and contradiction. Donald Trump is trying to do something very difficult, and that difficulty is now showing in every line of his war message. He wants to sound absolute without sounding trapped. He wants to project force without admitting how unstable the situation remains. He wants to tell the American public that the United States is moving fast, winning hard, and staying in control, even as his own words reveal a deeper problem. The military campaign may have momentum, but the political destination is still not clearly defined. That is the contradiction at the center of Trump's message. He says the war could be over soon. He says the campaign is ahead of schedule. He says the objectives are nearly complete. But at the same time, he threatens heavier escalation, speaks in the language of total defeat, and leaves the door open to a much broader outcome inside Iran. Those are not small differences in tone. They point to a structural tension inside the strategy itself. A government can move quickly in military terms and still be uncertain in political terms. In fact, that is often when the language becomes most aggressive, when leaders are trying to conceal that the endgame is less solid than the optics of strength suggest. Trump's instinct is clear. He believes speed is power. He believes confidence itself can shape events. He believes that if he speaks as though the war is moving toward closure, he can help force closure into existence. There is a certain brutal logic to that. In politics, perception matters. In markets, perception matters. In deterrence, perception matters. But there is a limit to how far perception can carry a conflict once the core question remains unanswered. What does victory actually mean? This is where the message becomes vulnerable. If victory means reducing Iran's missile capacity, that is one kind of war. If victory means breaking Iran's command structure, that is another. If victory means forcing a compliant government in Tehran, that is something much larger and far more dangerous. The problem is that Trump's rhetoric keeps moving across all three levels. He speaks like a commander closing out a successful operation, but he also speaks like a president who has not ruled out redesigning the political outcome of the entire conflict. That is how narrow missions begin to drift into open-ended ambitions. And history is very clear on this point. Wars do not become prolonged only because militaries fail. They often become prolonged because political goals expand faster than leaders are willing to admit. Tactical success creates temptation. When the first targets fall, decision-makers start asking whether this is the moment to go further, press harder, demand more. That is how a campaign framed as urgent and limited begins to absorb the logic of regime pressure, strategic humiliation, and total transformation. Once that happens, time stops working in your favor. Trump is also managing another battlefield entirely: the American public. He knows that modern presidents are not judged by foreign policy in the abstract. They are judged by whether voters feel safe, stable, and economically secure. So his war language is doing double duty. It is directed outward at Iran, but also inward at the U.S. audience. He wants Americans to hear strength without hearing quagmire. He wants them to hear progress without hearing risk. He wants them to believe this is controlled force, not strategic drift. But controlled force requires disciplined political definition. And right now, that definition is still missing. The more Trump says the war is nearly complete while simultaneously escalating the stakes, the more he exposes the gap between military action and political clarity. That gap matters. It shapes how allies calculate, how adversaries resist, and how long markets remain on edge. So the real story in Trump's message is not just strength. It is strain. It is the strain of a presidency trying to compress war into a narrative of command before the conflict itself has fully chosen its shape. And that is always a dangerous moment, because when leaders begin speaking in contradictions, it usually means the war is becoming harder to contain than they want the public to see. Iran's strategy: weakened, but not without tools. Iran is hurt, but Iran is not helpless. That is the first point Americans need to understand if they want to read this war clearly. Too often, when a country takes heavy military damage, people assume the story is moving in only one direction. They assume pressure automatically leads to surrender, that disruption leads to collapse, and that once a state has lost assets, initiative, and breathing room, it has lost strategy itself. That is not how serious conflicts work. In fact, some of the most dangerous moments in war begin when a wounded state stops thinking in terms of symmetry and starts thinking only in terms of leverage. That is exactly where Iran is now. Tehran knows it cannot match the United States and Israel in raw conventional power. It cannot win a contest of air dominance, precision strike capacity, or military scale. Its infrastructure has been hit. Its leadership circle has been shaken. Its economy was already under pressure before this latest phase of war intensified. Civilian deaths have mounted. Key sites have been struck. But from the standpoint of the Iranian system, weakness does not erase agency. It changes the method. When direct strength is limited, strategy moves toward disruption, endurance, and political pain. That is why Iran's current posture should be read less as military bravado and more as strategic adaptation. Tehran is signaling that if it cannot stop attacks by meeting force with equal force, it can still alter the cost structure around the conflict. It can still make the war harder to finish, harder to contain, and harder to sell as a clean success. That matters because modern war is not won only by destroying targets. It is also shaped by who can stretch the opponent's timeline, shake the opponent's confidence, and force the opponent to spend more political and economic capital than expected. This is where many Western readings of Iran fall short. They often treat the regime as if it only has two settings: aggression or collapse. In reality, states under pressure often become more strategically inventive, not less. Iran has spent years building tools for exactly this kind of moment. Not tools for outright victory against a superpower, but tools for survival, delay, disruption, and bargaining. That includes geography, proxy relationships, missile pressure, maritime risk, ideological framing, and above all the ability to create uncertainty across a region the world cannot afford to ignore. Iran's refusal to rush back into negotiations with the United States fits that same logic. From Tehran's point of view, talks immediately after major strikes would not look like diplomacy. They would look like submission under fire. And for a regime built not only on state power but on the image of resistance, that is a very high political cost. Iranian leaders understand that in conflicts like this, perception inside the country matters almost as much as battlefield reality. If the state appears humiliated, it weakens not just its negotiating position abroad, but its claim to authority at home. This is why the appointment of Mujtaba Khamenei matters so much. It is not simply a succession event after the killing of Ali Khamenei. It is a message from the Iranian system that decapitation does not mean disintegration. The regime is trying to prove continuity under fire. It is telling its adversaries that leadership can be replaced faster than outside powers can redesign the internal structure of the state. That does not mean the transition is cost-free or stable in every respect. It means the system is trying to deny Washington and Israel the political victory that usually accompanies a major leadership blow. There is another layer here that Americans should not overlook. Iran is not only sending messages to its domestic audience. It is also speaking to the broader non-Western world. Tehran wants to cast this war not merely as a conflict over security, but as a struggle over sovereignty, coercion, and the right of stronger powers to impose political outcomes on weaker states. Whether one agrees with that framing is beside the point. The point is that Iran is trying to widen the argument beyond missiles and retaliation. It wants diplomatic and moral space, especially among countries that are deeply skeptical of Western claims about rules, order, and intervention. That is why this is a mistake to view Iran only through the lens of damage. Damage is real. But so is strategic patience. So is state pride. So is the logic of a regime that believes survival itself is a form of victory. Tehran does not need to defeat the United States militarily to complicate U.S. objectives. It only needs to remain functional, remain dangerous, and remain capable of making the war more expensive than Washington hoped. And that is the heart of Iran's strategy right now. Not dominance. Not parity. Not fantasy. Leverage under pressure. A wounded state, if it still understands the structure of the system around it, can do enormous strategic work with limited tools. Iran knows it cannot control the whole battlefield. But it believes it can still shape the terms of pain, the pace of escalation, and the difficulty of any claimed American victory. In wars like this, that is often enough to keep history open. Hormuz, inflation, and the American kitchen table. The Strait of Hormuz may look like a distant narrow waterway on a map, but for American families it is something much more intimate than that. It is a hidden pressure point beneath the costs of daily life. It is one of those places most people never think about until the world suddenly reminds them that global stability is built on a few fragile corridors, and that when one of those corridors comes under threat, the damage does not stay overseas. It moves. It spreads. It lands in the most ordinary corners of life. It lands in the family budget, the weekly grocery run, the commute to work, the delivery fee, the airline ticket, the power bill, and the small but very real fear that the economy is slipping out of reach again. That is why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. Not because it is dramatic. Not because it produces strong headlines. But because it sits at the intersection of energy, finance, trade, and political trust. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow passage. That means any threat there immediately becomes more than a military issue. It becomes a pricing issue, an insurance issue, a transport issue, a confidence issue, and eventually a governing issue. Once a conflict touches Hormuz, it stops being a regional war in the normal sense. It becomes a systemic risk event. And that phrase matters, systemic risk. Americans hear it and often think of banks, debt markets, or financial crises. But oil is one of the oldest forms of systemic risk in modern history. Oil sits upstream from almost every layer of economic life. It powers transport. It shapes shipping rates. It affects fertilizer, manufacturing, logistics, aviation, plastics, heating, and industrial production. It does not just influence one sector. It moves through the whole machine. That is what makes energy shocks so politically explosive. They are not contained. They multiply. Here is the simplest way to understand it. If oil prices rise sharply because the market believes Hormuz is at risk, the effect does not begin only when there is a full physical shutdown. The effect begins the moment participants in the system start behaving defensively. Tanker operators recalculate routes. Insurers charge more because the probability of loss rises. Freight markets price in danger. Refiners adjust purchases. Traders build in a larger risk premium. And because modern supply chains are deeply linked, each actor passes pressure to the next actor in line. By the time the public feels the pain, the logic has already spread across the system. This is one of the hardest truths in economics for the general public to see, because so much of the damage is front-loaded in expectation. People tend to imagine shortages as the result of actual empty shelves or halted shipments. But in a world of futures markets, financial hedging, maritime insurance, and fragile post-pandemic supply chains, fear itself has economic power. If enough firms believe a route is unsafe, they act as though disruption has already begun. That means the cost spike can arrive before the worst case physically happens. In that sense, Hormuz is not just a shipping lane. It is a trigger point for anticipatory inflation. And this is exactly why American leaders fear oil shocks more than they sometimes admit in public. They know military crises can be explained. They know strategic arguments can be packaged. They know voters may tolerate a degree of geopolitical uncertainty if they believe national security is at stake. But they also know there is a point where foreign policy becomes personal. The point is not a think tank panel. The point is not a briefing room. The point is the gas pump and the checkout line. That is where theory becomes emotion. Gasoline is not just another price in the American economy. It is one of the most politically loaded prices in the country. It is visible, repeated, emotionally sticky, and tied to everyday freedom. Americans may not check the price of crude futures, but they notice immediately when it costs more to fill the tank. They notice when the number rises week after week. They notice when higher fuel costs show up in food, deliveries, travel, and services. And because gasoline sits so close to routine life, it becomes a political symbol of whether the government is in control or falling behind events. That is why the threat around Hormuz is not merely an energy story. It is a public trust story. If the United States looks militarily strong but economically exposed, the public reads that as a contradiction. If Washington says it is protecting stability while households feel rising instability, people begin to doubt not just the policy, but the judgment behind it. This is one of the oldest political lessons in modern democracies. Strategic credibility abroad depends in part on economic credibility at home. There is also a deeper economic mechanism here that deserves more attention. Energy price shocks do not hit all households equally, and they do not hit the political system evenly either. Working families, hourly workers, rural drivers, delivery workers, small business owners, and lower-margin households feel the hit sooner and harder. Wealthier consumers can absorb a temporary spike more easily. That means the burden is regressive. It falls downward. It creates resentment because it feels unfair, and in many ways it is unfair. A geopolitical conflict driven by state power gets paid for, in part, by ordinary people with no influence over the decision-making that triggered it. That is where inflation becomes more than a technical term. Inflation is not only about numbers rising. It is about control slipping. It is about the quiet humiliation of having to think twice about things that used to feel manageable. It is about choosing between necessities. It is about the exhaustion of living in a permanent state of recalculation. When energy prices jump, they strike directly at that emotional layer of economic life. And once that happens, the politics changes fast. Voters stop asking who is right in some abstract geopolitical argument. They start asking who is making life harder, who failed to see this coming, and who is protecting them from the consequences. This is why Donald Trump's approach to the conflict cannot be separated from domestic economics, even if he would prefer to keep those conversations in different boxes. He understands that war abroad can quickly become inflation at home. He understands that energy is not just strategy but also sentiment. He understands that a president can look forceful on television and still suffer politically if the underlying price structure starts to turn against him. That is why the pressure to keep markets calm is not secondary to the war message. It is embedded inside it. From a political economy perspective, this is where the real structure of power becomes visible. Military force can destroy targets. But it cannot by itself prevent second-order effects from spreading across financial and consumer systems. Once traders, insurers, transport firms, and consumers all react at once, the government is no longer managing a battlefield alone. It is managing expectations, confidence, and social patience. That is a much harder task. History offers a blunt warning here. Energy shocks have repeatedly exposed the limits of political control. In the 1970s, the oil crisis did more than disrupt supply. It shattered public confidence in the ability of Western governments to guarantee prosperity and order at the same time. It fed inflation, weakened leaders, and changed politics for a generation. The lesson was not simply that oil matters. The lesson was that energy insecurity has the power to reorder the relationship between citizens and the state. That same logic applies now, even if the economic structure has evolved. Yes, the United States is in a stronger domestic energy position than it was in previous decades. Yes, markets have more hedging tools, more supply flexibility, and more experience with crisis management. But none of that erases the psychological and political force of a major energy disruption. If Hormuz becomes more unstable, the question is not whether America can survive it. Of course it can. The question is what kind of political damage accumulates while it does. And that is the issue many officials always try to speak around. A short shock is painful. A prolonged shock is corrosive. A temporary rise in prices can be managed. A sustained rise reshapes behavior, mood, and trust. It causes consumers to pull back. It pressures central banks. It weakens business confidence. It feeds arguments that the government is overextended abroad while people at home are carrying too much weight. The economic term for this is pass-through. But politically, it feels like abandonment. There is another critical layer here: the relationship between inflation and national power. Great powers do not lose leverage only when they lose battles. They also lose leverage when external conflicts begin to generate internal fragility. If the price of asserting strength abroad is a weaker social compact at home, then the strategy becomes harder to sustain. Rivals understand this. They do not need to defeat the United States directly if they can help intensify domestic strain inside the American system. That is why economic resilience is not a soft issue. It is strategic depth. So when Americans hear about the Strait of Hormuz, they should not hear a distant foreign phrase. They should hear a warning about how tightly their lives are connected to the structure of global power. They should understand that this narrow channel is one of the points where geopolitics enters daily economics. And they should recognize that if this conflict keeps tightening around oil, the deepest consequences may not first appear in military communiques. They may appear in the places that matter most to ordinary people: the family budget, the sense of security, and the feeling that the system is either working for them or slowly turning against them. That is why this part of the story matters so much. Hormuz is not just about shipping. Inflation is not just about statistics. And the American kitchen table is not just a metaphor. It is the final place where strategic choices are judged. In the end, every government involved in a conflict like this claims it is defending order. But if that defense sends disorder into millions of homes, then the war has already crossed a line that no press conference can fully contain. Lebanon, Hezbollah, and the collapse of the middle ground. Lebanon is where this war loses the illusion of clean lines. If Iran is the headline and Israel is the principal military actor on one front, Lebanon is where the deeper regional truth becomes impossible to ignore. Once a conflict runs through proxy networks, fragile states, and contested sovereignty, there is no real middle ground left for civilians to stand on. There is only exposure. There is only pressure. And there is only the question of how much of a country can remain politically intact when armed power inside its borders does not fully answer to the state. That is why Lebanon matters so much right now. Not as a side theater. Not as a distraction from the main conflict. But as a warning about what happens when regional war moves through a political system that has never fully regained control of force. Israel is not only striking fighters or launch points. It is also going after the connective tissue around Hezbollah: storage, logistics, financial infrastructure, and the spaces where military, political, and social power blur together. That tells us this is not just a campaign of retaliation. It is a campaign aimed at the operating capacity of Hezbollah as an embedded system. That distinction is critical. Hezbollah is not just an armed group in the narrow sense. It is also a political actor, a social actor, a financial actor, and a strategic extension of Iran's regional architecture. That means pressure against Hezbollah does not stay confined to the battlefield. It spreads into neighborhoods, institutions, and the fragile daily life of a country already weakened by years of economic collapse, political fragmentation and broken public trust. When Israel strikes assets tied to Al-Qard al-Hassan, it is not simply targeting money. It is targeting one of the mechanisms through which Hezbollah sustains loyalty, resilience, and influence. In modern conflict, financial systems are not secondary. They are part of the battlefield because they help convert ideology into endurance. And yet this is precisely where the moral and political danger becomes more severe. The more deeply a militia is woven into the fabric of society, the harder it becomes to isolate it without pulling civilian life into the blast radius. This is the tragedy of hybrid power. Hezbollah's strength is not just that it has rockets. Its strength is that it exists inside a state too weak to fully displace it, and a society too fractured to fully escape its shadow. That makes every escalation more punishing for ordinary Lebanese people, many of whom did not choose this confrontation but will still bear its costs. This is why the words of Joseph Aoun carry such weight. His criticism of Hezbollah was not merely rhetorical. It was the voice of a state trying to separate itself from a force inside its own borders that has helped define the country's strategic destiny without fully submitting to the country's constitutional authority. When Aoun accuses Hezbollah of betraying Lebanon's interests and acting according to the calculations of Iran, he is not just making a political argument. He is exposing the central fracture of the Lebanese state. Lebanon is internationally recognized as sovereign, but sovereignty means very little if the government does not hold a true monopoly over decisions of war and peace. That is the real collapse of the middle ground. It is not just geographic. It is institutional. The Lebanese government wants direct talks with Israel. It wants a truce. It wants security arrangements on the border. It wants the Lebanese military to reclaim authority and replace militia logic with state logic. But wanting sovereignty and possessing sovereignty are not the same thing. A weak state often speaks the language of order while living inside the reality of divided force. That is where Lebanon stands now. Israel, meanwhile, sees little reason to trust a distinction between Lebanon and Hezbollah if attacks continue to emerge from Lebanese territory. From a military standpoint, that logic is easy to understand. From a political and humanitarian standpoint, it is devastating. Because once the border between state and militia collapses in the eyes of a stronger military power, the entire national space becomes vulnerable to wider punishment. Evacuation orders, expanding strike zones, and attacks on infrastructure all begin to follow from that logic. Amnesty International is right to raise alarms here. Mass evacuation does not magically turn civilian zones into morally empty space. And when war begins to treat large parts of a country as functionally contaminated by militia presence, the law of war is strained by the logic of total security. Lebanon also reveals the wider regional pattern. Across the Middle East, states are being pulled into a conflict they do not fully command. Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iraq, and others are being forced to adapt to a war whose center keeps widening. But Lebanon is the clearest case because it shows how proxy conflict hollows out national sovereignty from within. A country can still have institutions, elections, ministries, and international recognition, yet remain unable to keep itself from becoming a battlefield for larger powers. And that is the deepest lesson here. When the state is weaker than the networks operating inside it, diplomacy becomes fragile, deterrence becomes unstable, and civilians become hostages to structures they never voted to empower. Lebanon is not merely being caught in the crossfire. Lebanon is exposing the architecture of the whole crisis. This is what regional war looks like when it moves through fractured states. The armed actor claims resistance, the government pleads for order, the external power escalates for security, and ordinary people are left standing in the ruins of a middle ground that no longer exists. The war of legitimacy, law, language, and the shape of power. Power does not move on missiles alone. It moves on language, legality, and the ability of a government to persuade its own people, its allies, and the wider world that what it is doing is necessary, limited, and justified. That is why the war over Iran is not only being fought in the air and on the ground. It is also being fought in the domain of legitimacy. And once that battle begins, every word matters, every legal claim matters, and every contradiction matters even more. The first warning sign is the way the rationale for this war has kept shifting. At one stage, the emphasis was on stopping Iran from advancing toward nuclear weapons. Then the focus moved to degrading missile and drone capacity. Then the argument widened to weakening the military infrastructure behind Iran's regional influence. After that, the language moved again, closer to the logic of political transformation, talk of a compliant government, talk of leadership outcomes, talk that edges toward surrender rather than containment. That pattern is never trivial. When a government changes the reason for war as the war unfolds, it usually means one of two things. Either the strategy is evolving faster than the public was told, or the public story is being adjusted to fit a broader strategy that leaders were not ready to fully admit at the start. That matters because democracies do not function on force alone. They function on consent, and consent depends on clarity. Citizens can support hard action when they believe the objective is defined, lawful, and tied to a real security need. But when the objective starts moving, the trust beneath that support becomes fragile. A narrow operation sounds different from a campaign that may reshape the political order inside another state. Those are not variations of the same mission. Those are different missions with different timelines, different risks, and different moral consequences. This is why language is not decoration in wartime. Language is part of the machinery of power. When leaders say, "We didn't start this war, we're finishing it," they are doing more than describing events. They are framing the moral sequence. They are telling the public that force is not a choice but a burden. They are taking offensive action and placing it inside the emotional structure of reluctant necessity. That phrase is powerful because it simplifies. It turns complex escalation into a story of cleanup, closure, and responsibility. But the simplicity is exactly what makes it dangerous. It compresses scrutiny. It invites obedience. And it lowers the threshold for asking whether the action being taken is still proportional to the threat being described. We have seen this pattern in many wars. States often soften the label before they widen the mission. They use phrases like limited operation, defensive strike, security action, or special operation because those terms reduce the political shock of what is actually happening. The softer the wording, the easier it becomes to preserve flexibility at home while expanding options abroad. But civilians do not experience war as vocabulary. Families in strike zones do not live inside legal euphemisms. Markets do not react to rhetorical finesse. The reality eventually tears through the language. And that is where the legal dimension becomes central. International law is often treated in television debates as a moral side issue, something separate from hard power. That is a mistake. Legality is not an ornament. It is a force multiplier when it is strong, and a strategic liability when it is weak. A campaign widely seen as legally defensible can hold alliances together longer, preserve diplomatic patience, and reduce the reputational cost of collateral damage. A campaign seen as legally stretched or openly inconsistent begins to corrode the coalition around it. Support does not usually collapse all at once. It decays. Quietly at first, then visibly. That is why controversies around civilian deaths, school strikes, broad evacuation orders, and attacks on dual-use infrastructure matter so much. They are not just humanitarian footnotes. They are legitimacy stress tests. Every time the legal and moral case grows harder to explain, the war's political foundation becomes thinner. And once the political foundation thins, the state has to rely more heavily on force and less on persuasion. That is always a dangerous shift for any democracy. From the standpoint of political economy, legitimacy is a form of strategic capital. It helps governments manage allies, markets, and public patience at the same time. Lose too much of it, and even a successful military campaign begins to generate wider instability. Allies hesitate. Critics grow louder. Consumers get nervous. Opponents gain narrative ground. The war may continue operationally, but the structure supporting it becomes weaker. That is the deeper danger here. When law becomes elastic and language becomes vague, power often grows more aggressive precisely because its justification is becoming less stable. And history teaches a hard lesson: wars with unstable justifications rarely remain limited. They drift, they harden, and they ask the public for more than they were promised at the start. What happens next? The three paths ahead. What happens next will not be decided by a single speech, a single strike, or a single headline. It will be decided by whether the major actors in this conflict still believe they can control the chain reaction they have already unleashed. That is the real question now. Not whether the United States and Israel can hit Iran harder. Not whether Iran can still inflict pain. We already know both of those things are true. The real question is whether the system around this war can absorb more pressure without breaking into something much larger, much more expensive, and much harder to reverse. From where I sit, there are three paths ahead. The first is controlled de-escalation. This is the outcome leaders often hope they can reach after proving enough strength to claim advantage without paying the full price of prolonged conflict. In this scenario, Donald Trump continues speaking in the language of strength, but quietly narrows the practical scope of escalation. He frames the campaign as successful, says the major military objectives have largely been achieved, and creates space for indirect diplomacy without ever calling it retreat. Iran, for its part, keeps the rhetoric of resistance but avoids crossing the line that would trigger a much deeper American response. The region remains tense, but the system holds. Oil stabilizes. Markets calm. Shipping resumes under pressure, but not paralysis. This is the least destructive path, but it is also the most fragile, because it requires every side to show restraint while still pretending it is not restraining itself. The second path is the one history tells us is often more likely: the pressure war. Not peace. Not full regional catastrophe. Just a grinding middle phase where nobody truly backs down and nobody truly breaks through. In that world, the conflict becomes a rolling crisis. Strikes continue. Threats continue. Shipping risk remains elevated. Markets swing on every signal. Iran keeps searching for leverage. Israel keeps widening pressure where it sees strategic need. The United States stays involved enough to shape events, but not enough to fully close them. Lebanon remains exposed. Hezbollah remains active. The Gulf remains nervous. And ordinary people across multiple countries begin paying the long-term cost of a war that never formally becomes total, yet never meaningfully ends. This is the most politically corrosive scenario because it drains confidence slowly. It turns emergency into atmosphere. The third path is full regional escalation. This is the most dangerous path because once the conflict crosses that threshold, events start moving faster than strategies. A deeper disruption around the Strait of Hormuz, heavier strikes on energy infrastructure, wider missile exchanges across more borders, and intensified action by Hezbollah would fundamentally change the character of the war. At that point, the central challenge would no longer be managing pressure. It would be containing collapse. More governments would be pulled in directly. More populations would feel the shock economically and psychologically. The United States would face the question every great power fears: whether a war it tried to keep limited now demands a broader commitment to preserve credibility, deterrence, and regional order. That is how strategic choice turns into strategic trap. So what should Americans watch? Watch for the gap between rhetoric and behavior. If Trump keeps saying the war could end soon while the acceptable target list keeps expanding, that tells you the political message is trying to outrun the strategic reality. Watch Iran's posture around escalation. A state under pressure may avoid formal surrender while still probing for ways to raise costs indirectly. Watch Lebanon, because weak states often show first where regional containment is failing. Watch the energy system closely, not just headline prices but the deeper signals, maritime risk, insurance pressure, and the market's sense of whether stability is real or only being narrated. The deepest truth is this: wars become hardest to stop when each side still believes one more push will improve its position. That is the danger now. Trump may believe more pressure will force closure. Iran may believe more endurance will force respect. Israel may believe broader pressure will restore deterrence. Hezbollah may believe continued resistance preserves relevance. Each actor has its own logic. But systems do not care about the logic of individual players. Systems respond to accumulated stress. And that is why this moment requires clarity, not fantasy. The United States can project power. Iran can still impose costs. Israel can continue escalating pressure. But none of that answers the central strategic question: can this war still be shaped, or is it beginning to shape the region on its own terms? That is what happens next. Not a neat ending. Not a clean triumph. But a test of whether power, once set in motion, can still be governed before it turns into something even its architects can no longer fully control. What this story ultimately reveals is not just the movement of missiles, oil tankers, or political statements. It reveals how power really works in the modern world. Donald Trump speaks the language of speed, strength, and total control. Iran answers with pressure, endurance, and strategic disruption. Israel pushes military force deeper into the region. Hezbollah expands the danger zone through proxy escalation. Lebanon struggles to defend the very idea of state sovereignty inside its own borders. And behind all of them stands the invisible force tying everything together: oil, markets, inflation, fear, and the fragile confidence of ordinary people trying to live normal lives while governments play for strategic advantage. This is what makes the story so powerful. No one in this crisis operates in isolation. A strike in Iran can shake a family budget in America. A threat in the Strait of Hormuz can alter political calculations in Washington. A militia decision in Lebanon can expose the weakness of an entire state. A sentence from Trump can move markets, but only for a moment. In the end, reality always demands a price. And that price is usually paid first by ordinary citizens, not by the leaders who make the biggest declarations. The deeper lesson is clear: strength without clarity becomes danger. Power without limits becomes instability. And any government that claims it is defending order must be judged by one simple test: does it leave people more secure or more exposed? That lesson matters in daily life too. On a personal level, emotions, pressure, and pride can push us toward decisions that feel strong in the moment but create bigger damage over time. Real wisdom is not just about reacting hard. It is about seeing the wider system, understanding consequences early, and knowing when control is already starting to slip. In politics, economics, and life, discipline matters more than noise. Here's a quick question for you. A. The real center of this conflict is still military power alone. B. The real center of this conflict is the link between military force, oil, and economic pressure. Comment A or B below. And what do you think? Is this war heading toward controlled de-escalation, or toward a much wider regional crisis? Share your view in the comments so everyone can read and compare perspectives. And subscribe to the channel to support us and keep this kind of sharp, honest analysis going.